There we go. Okay, so let me go back. I thought we were already recording. So here we go, just so people know what this is. The topic of this webinar is, and our first chat question. Okay, so here is the our goal here, which is first talk about a little bit about the mission of the Congressional Research Service. And I think that is important because the way CRS memos are designed is all related to their mission. Understanding how advising and advocacy differs from advocacy when it comes to writing, trying to balance background versus recommendations, the kind of products that CRS provides, and what distinguishes a CRS in focus report, or really I would call it a policy brief from a traditional one. And then at the end, I'm hoping we can workshop some of your writing. So this was part of the announcement that went out. So hopefully you can find something. So it doesn't matter what it is. It just, it's definitely not meant to be our CRS memo or note or anything else. So it's just something so that you can take a look at it and say, okay, well, if I was going to do this in a CRS style, what changes would I make? So we won't do that till the end, but if you don't have something handy, as I'm chit-chatting away here, hopefully you can find something. So why am I talking about this? Because I worked for CRS for several years. I have put on here some of the reports that I did. I was at the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine for 18 years. And then I went to the Congressional Research Service to be a specialist in science technology policy. I thought I would be there like my predecessor was for maybe like another 18 years. But in the meantime, somebody said, hey, would you like to work for the Obama White House? And I said, I just couldn't turn it down. And so therefore I left CRS, even though I expected that to be my long-term home, and went over to the White House, and then, but now I'm in Pittsburgh. So you never know which way your paths are going to take. The most popular, this is not all the publications that I did. But the one that's most popular is this one up here in the corner, which is the primer on science technology policy, which is meant for new staff, congressional staff coming into Congress and working on science technology policy issues and not knowing anything about it. Part of the reason I'm doing this, you'll see that was done in 2009. People still use it, even though it's like very out of date. And so I am in the process of writing a book that's going to cover some of that material and even more about science technology policymaking. And some of you might have seen that in some of the items that I've sent out on Twitter and other places. The other one, which is very popular still after all these years, is this one here, comparing the Manhattan Project, the Apollo program, and federal energy technology R&D programs. That's because, about every single year, remember Congress says, we should have something like the Apollo program or the Manhattan Project or whatever. And I said, well, I'm just going to figure out exactly what that would mean if we really did something like that. So those are still the popular ones that are out there. Okay, so let's go with the Congressional Research Service for what it is. So a key element here is understanding that it's a shared service. In other words, it doesn't matter what party you are or who you are, any individual member of Congress, any committee members, any staff member can reach out to the Congressional Research Service and ask for information and analysis. It is part of the Library of Congress. In fact, one of the cool things when I was working for CRS is I could request any book from the Library of Congress and it would magically appear on my desk. And that was one of the sort of fun things about it, because everybody, there's a law, by the way, that I think 2 copies of every book has to be sent to the Library of Congress. So they definitely have everything. So what people didn't understand, I myself didn't understand until I worked there, is that those reports that I showed you were only about 1/3 of what I did. What I primarily did was write confidential memos and briefings and consultations. That's where the second bullet is, which says tailored confidential memos, briefings, and so forth. So, I might do something. A lot of what I did was do the analysis before someone introduced a bill. So my busiest time was in that end of the year, December timeframe, like between the congressional sessions, because that's when people really were working to like introduce, legislation on different things. I also, there was also say consultation. So one time somebody from like one of the appropriations committee says, for CJS, which is Commerce, Justice, and Science, said, well, I came from the justice side. I didn't know anything about science. And so I spent time with him saying, okay, here's how science works in terms of from a budgetary standpoint. Then I did seminars and workshops on different topics, where congressional staff could come and learn about it. So any of you who I know, like Melody, who are going to become congressional fellows, you really should take advantage of those workshops because you really get an in-depth understanding of how Congress, really works beyond what's in a textbook from the top experts in the world. You can provide testimony and so forth. So actually, there would be literally hundreds of people. People would call you on the phone, say, I need this, maybe even during a hearing, and they'd say, hey, I need the answer to this question. So because my member wants to ask it the next time that he's chatting. Right. So that was a lot of what I did. Despite this, there was a review process also for everything that I put out. So I just wanted to kind of give you a feeling for it. It is extremely neutral. And like when I interviewed for the job, one of the worries they had about hiring me was that I'd be too much in favor of science and engineering. They felt I could not be sufficiently neutral. They said, well, can you write a memo that gives the 10 reasons why the United States should not, the federal government should not fund science and engineering research? So, and I said, yes, I could come up with those reasons, but that kind of gives you an idea. There's no presumption that a particular action is necessary. So the Congressional Research Service has been around for a long time. This is, it says 1914, but even before that, there was like Legislative Research Service, and most state capitals also have something like the Legislative Reference Service or Research Bureau, and that comes from the model of the Congressional Research Service. It runs congress.gov, which is where you go to learn about bills and things like that. And it really is a place, for analysis. If you just want facts, there is a separate set of people who all they do is provide facts. So if you want to know how many cows are in Montana, then they will provide that answer for you, but they're going to delve down. Like, what kind of cows? Do you mean dairy cows? Or do you mean cattle that are for meat? Or do you want, like famous cows? I mean, and so you have to really get into the specifics. So CRS has 400 policy analysts, which you might think is a lot, but it's much smaller than one of its sister congressional support offices, which is the Government Accountability Office, which I think has several thousand people. And they're split up into different divisions. So you can see these before. Where I was in resources, science, and industry. But it should be said that life sciences were not in resources, science, and industry, but they were up, I believe, in domestic social policy. So this knowledge services group, those are the people that give that will find the facts for you. So I want to talk a little bit about job stuff because everybody's always interested. I just clipped this out. This is the listings of all the job openings that are currently available. I sent out a note when the division I used to work for was hiring 12 people, which is like phenomenal in terms of how many people that they would hire. And then there's also something they have, which are these entry-level positions. So like you could come through as a presidential management fellow, And then, you know, this would be part of your rotation. You'll see here, I put this thing for the graduate recruit program, just in case some of you might be interested in that. And these are like short-term positions. You only go in for a number of months, but it is a good way to get experience and sort of really learn what was going on. And some of those people did eventually go on to be hired. The main thing I would say, most of the people, so I've certainly had former students and so forth who've been hired by CRS. It's really helpful if you have some real world experience, as opposed to just coming straight out of a graduate school program. But they are trying to hire a lot younger people because people stay there for so long that they need to have, you know, more diversity in their ages. Okay, so moving on. This is a very handy website from the University of Washington that gives an amazingly good perspective on CRS. What's interesting is they did not provide reports online by order of Congress for like almost 100 years. But in 2018, they did pass a law that made CRS reports publicly accessible. It wasn't that you couldn't get access to the reports. You're supposed to request them through your member of Congress. And then some people put bootleg copies up and things like that. But now all the CRS reports have gone online, which makes life much easier for everybody. Now you see here at the bottom are all the different kinds of products that CRS provides. So we're going to talk about the first two. The first one is the reports, like the ones that I showed you. In focus are the 2-page documents, and I wouldn't call them memos. I would call them policy briefs. They're meant to provide like an overview on a topic. They now do infographics. They do insights, which are kind of like in focus, but they're more like analytical on a specific topic. And there's legal sidebars, and there's testimony. So you find them on this page, which, by the way, I will send the slide deck here. I will send to NSPN to send to everybody who registered for this event. So, but if you go to this page, you can type in any topic and you can see the CRS reports. It's important to do this. And the reason why, and this is one of the advantages I felt working at CRS over the National Academies, is I sometimes would update one of my reports like 2 or 3 times the same day if it was very active on the Hill. So you always want to make sure that you have the most recent version of the report. And the only way to do that is through this website. Because if you know, like particularly when it comes to funding and things like that, things move, you know, like really quickly. Now, the downside is they have not updated the whole backlog of all the CRS reports that have been issued. So there's other places to go for them. The best place generally for our reports related to science technology policies, Federation of American Scientists. That was a place where most people went to in S&T policy before this. But there's also other ones that you can sort of see out here where you can get things. What you should not do is you should not go to Amazon, because CRS reports are not copyrighted. And so therefore there are reports up there with my name on them, by the way, that you can get for Amazon that somebody's actually selling for you. This used to irritate my colleagues a great deal. Somebody charged like $90 or something for something that they wrote on like Homeland Security issues. And none of that money went to the person who actually wrote it. It went to somebody else who just picked it up and put it on Amazon. So this is the good part about it is that when you yourself are writing something, you can use any of the graphics and things like that from a CRS report without requesting any permission, because it is intentionally not copyrighted. So here's our another sort of the major collections that are out there. For those of you who are in academia, CQ, Congressional Quarterly, is a good place to get like the older reports and things like that, or Hein Online, that's another good place that most people have access to. This UNT Digital Library, they also have a lot of reports, and that's free on the web. So my next question for you guys is, have you ever entered one of the policy memo conditions or applied to be an NSPS SciPol Scholar in residence? Again, just put yes or no in your chat box there. Okay, so we got a good mix of people. So part of the reason I was asked to do this webinar is because I was a judge for one of these events. And when I looked at the memos that I was asked to review, I said, these are not CRS style memos. And I said this for every single one that I saw. And so in their wisdom, NSPN said, okay, well, if that's not what one is, what is one? And hence I am here today. So these are the things, first, like what CRS documents are. And this is true for all documents, regardless of style. So they're well written and are focused on the policymaker as an audience. They're extremely neutral. So the reader should not be able to identify the author's opinion on an issue. They're historically accurate and provide the status quo. In other words, what Congress has done so far. They're up to date, they're heavily referenced, they incorporate original graphics, not always, but almost all the time. And they go through this multi-stage peer review process. So when I wrote something, whether it be an email or whether it be a long report, I had to have 3 of my colleagues, the same level as me, look at it. Then I had to have the person who was head of my section look at it, then the head of my division, and then the review office for all of Congressional Research Service. And sometimes all that had to be done within hours, within a day. Like someone would ask me for something in the morning, and I'd have to have it written and reviewed by the end of the day. So one thing is that if you're thinking about CRS, you have to be somebody who likes to be at their desk writing and thinking all day long, because it is a think tank for Congress. So think about it as you're a like reference librarian, and I could not easily go off the reservation, like even to seminars and things like that, because I was supposed to be there on call when anybody contacted me, and people did. So I understand it. So the documents that I reviewed did not most of them maybe did not meet this sort of basic standard, particularly that aspect of neutrality. So these are other things that people did that CRS documents do not. So first, some of them presume that action is necessary, a particular action, rather than present alternative viewpoints as to whether or not an action should be taken. So let's just say you were doing something like on alternative energy. You would not presume that alternative energy is like the best way to respond to climate change, as an example. Because maybe when you think about it from a policy standpoint, maybe it's better to have a carbon tax, and maybe that would result eventually in renewable energy. But according to economists, it would the most efficient methods, and maybe it would instead result in people driving their cars less, which would be less expensive than building renewable energy sources. I'm just kind of giving you some idea. So there's no presumption of action, because it's not you who decides whether or not to take the action. It is Congress who decides whether or not to take the action. The other thing is that congressional CRS reports do not make recommendations. You can only provide options. And then for each of those options, you need to give a pro and a con. So And sometimes you would say, meet with a staffer, and the staffer would say, hey, you've done all this work on this topic. What do you think I should do? And we were not allowed to answer that question. Okay, then the second part is just, again, focusing on one option without discussing alternatives. So even if you were, say, writing a report on renewable energy, you would still want to make sure you said, in addition to, alternative energy infrastructure, some other options might be A, B, C. And you might even link to other reports, CRS reports, that talked about those things. They don't provide background without analysis. So like some things I would see, they give, say, a whole description about, say, alternative energy in the United States, but it's nothing that could not have just been picked up from the web, right? So you're trying to provide unique value, and that means doing unique analysis to try to say, okay, to try to focus on that issue. How much background you would provide will vary, because if I, for example, was writing a report that was meant for a broader audience, I might have more background than, say, a memo, because in the case of a memo, which is to a specific individual, let's just say somebody on Senate Energy, I don't need to say anything about the relationship between energy and climate change, right? Because they know this already at Senate Energy. But if it's a more broader document, then I need to provide a bit more background, but still not too much. So the other example, the other thing is using jargon without explanation. So you do have to include sometimes like some sort of technical kinds of terms, because that is part of the language of the policy world. Something like, say, a renewable energy tax credit or something. But you couldn't do that without explaining what it is. And sometimes that was one of the hardest things to do, was try to find ways to explain things. You can't use words like should, but you need to use words like could or might. And you don't focus too much on the science and technology aspects of it, other than to the extent that information is needed to understand the policy implications of an issue. Okay, so before I go, I'm going to go into some examples with some real CRS stuff. But does anybody have any questions? You can either type in chat or just open up your mic.
So I had a quick question. Do any other policy memos or documents that are used to help policymakers make informed decisions kind of deviate from this format, or is it is anything legit going to be in this format, written in this style?
Okay, so if this, I'm only talking about Congressional Research Service documents, right? They, which are, the reason congressional staff likes them is because they're not biased one way or another, okay? That does not mean that congressional staff don't get analysis and memos from hundreds of organizations, particularly when an issue is active. So say, for example, like when I was at the National Academies, and I was putting together, say, a policy brief that summarized, a report that might be several hundred pages. It did have recommendations in it, and it did have analysis in it. But the authority of it came from the organization. So this style is not true for all memos, for all reports, and so forth that are out there in the world, only for CRS documents. And maybe there's other organizations out there, there's actually something quite similar to CRS, which is in the UK. And I know the person I've worked with them in the past, who's there from the UK version of CRS. And they might well do something similar, but I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at their documents.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Okay. So let me see here. So Tony, okay, what do you do if there doesn't seem to be more than one policy choice possible on an issue? The answer is there's always many, if not literally hundreds of policy choices on an issue. So do you want to give an example, Tony, where you think there isn't a policy choice? Yeah, there's only one policy choice. Okay. Okay, so you can't think of one offhand, but sometimes some choices seem to be off the table. I don't think in CRS land, I don't think there's any options that are off the table. Yeah. Yeah. Plus, as Melody says, there's always the do nothing option, which I always like to emphasize. Thank you, Melody. Is that the most common action is no action, the status quo. That's why it's really important to understand the existing policy, which is part of what CRS does, is making sure people know what the current policy is, because a lot of times, and this is, I would say, one of the most common things I encounter, is that people think that nothing is happening. When something is happening, it's just not happening to the extent that you want it to happen. So, but there's always, even if you agree on, like, say, something like renewable energy, there's so many different ways to do it. And even then, within renewable energy, there can be a battle between, wind versus solar versus geothermal, and things like that. So even if you, like, say, agree that you want to do a ton of energy, there's so many different ways to do it, so many different policy mechanisms. Okay, any last questions on this before we move on?
I have a question, Debbie, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, Lindsay. Yeah, thanks.
So my question is kind of how do you balance like document space versus like remaining unbiased? Because of course, if I wanted to elaborate on every single policy option that is available, and I had 100 pages to do it, it would be no problem.
Right.
But if you're writing a short memo, you might have to be you have to be more judicious about like which ones you select. And I can see that potentially being at conflict with remaining unbiased. Like, say I'm writing a CRS style memo to someone who I know has an agenda. Like, let's say we're thinking of something using the issue of climate change, like the infrastructure bill of President Biden, which kind of had this angle of trying to find, like renewable options for climate change. Do I use that space to provide options that are kind of, in line with that, because they seem like something to be worth that person's time to read? Or do I throw options in there that are, really mixed with this idea of being, unbiased? But in some ways, I can see that kind of being like a waste of space because that person's not going to consider it. So if you could, is there a way to strike that balance at all?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's, good question. So so what you have to really look at is the key stakeholders. Okay. So you just don't come up with these policy options like out of your head. Even though, of course, I would be obviously a brilliant policymaker and I would definitely have opinions. But instead, let's just take President Biden's infrastructure bill. So you would say something like, President Biden's infrastructure bill suggests investing in fact, this is one I saw today, ARPA-C, which is an Advanced Research Projects Agency for Climate. Okay. However, others believe that this is not a good option, and instead we should do A, B, C. Okay. So what they don't need to know, again, you have to think about your member of Congress as the audience. they don't need to know all the options. They just need to know the key options from the key stakeholders. And in fact, when you're writing it, you have to go back and sort of cite these individuals. So like I couldn't just put in an option unless I could find somebody who proposed it and give a citation to them. So that's how you kind of like get the options down to a manageable level. Because literally, like I said, there's hundreds of different options. But, and this is true even like when I teach policy analysis, is you can just sit there and at first you brainstorm, maybe 20, 30 different options. But in the end, you only really want to do like the status quo plus 2 more. And so you have to do an initial assessment, an initial screening to figure out which are the most likely to do those 4 E's that I talked about, that effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and acceptability. Because the other ones are just not worth your time to analyze. That work, Lindsay? Okay. So let me see, I got some more questions here in chat. Okay, to what extent, if any, do you consider the audience for the report? Even if a specific office requested it, would you still write it to a general office? No. If I'm writing for a specific office, or was writing for a specific office, I write it as a memo only to that office. It is not a public document. It is a confidential memo. Now, what I would do is after I completed the product and delivered it, I would ask the staff that I wrote the memo for, I said, can I take some of this content and turn it into a general audience report? And most of the time they would say yes. And the reason why is because, if they're introducing a bill on some, say, energy related thing, I say this because I did a lot of work for Senate Energy, then they want that information to be out there, right? The analysis that I provided to them. Now, I'm not going to favor their legislation, but part of what you do in a CRS report is talk about existing congressional activity. And so I would have that like at the end, that are, somewhere in between. So that's, that would be how I would handle that. But if it's for a specific office, it's confidential, it's only for them, and they don't want it to be out there because this is like their bill, right? And so they need to, in order for a bill to be successful, they need to get co-sponsors. And so they might take your memo and they might share it with other people because they need to try to make it bipartisan, in both houses. And if they're in the Senate, they need somebody in the House to support it, and the House needs somebody in the Senate to support it. And so a lot of those discussions are confidential. So it would not be something that would be immediate. It would be probably, like several months after that, because they would want it to be confidential because they're the ones who've done the work behind getting the bill to be introduced. Okay, so I hope that helped whoever that was. Melody. Okay, Tony, what do you do if there's far more depth of research on one policy option than the others? Just because there's more research on one option doesn't mean you spend more writing, more paper on that option. Because in the end, you have to focus it. You want to always make any policy writing as short as you possibly can. And you just need to be able to answer those 4 E things that I mentioned before that I talked about. Is it effective in reaching the goal? Is it economically efficient, get the best bang for the buck versus the other options? Is it equitable, like who are winners, who are losers? And ease of acceptability in the sense of understanding who is likely to strongly support or strongly oppose the bill. Okay, so hopefully that answered your question, Tony. Any last ones before we move on? Okay. Okay, so these are this report. This is a full report. So I thought it'd be best to start with a full report before I started with a shorter version. And so I went and I looked at the CRS reports that have been issued in the past month or so. I found this one. I just obviously focusing on SEC policy ones. This one, which is on lead in drinking water. That is from somebody who works for my old division. So you can see, first let's just kind of look at the contents. This paper is about 18 pages. It has some appendices, so basically say 20 pages or so. So that is a pretty good solid size for a report. You'll see that there's background that's several pages before they get into the policy side. So this is all policy. This is the lead and copper rule, so forth. So that's where most of the information is on the policy, the existing policy, and the proposed revision to the policy. And then you have down here considerations on implementation and enforcement, and those go back to the issue of effectiveness, right? Going back to my 4 E's here. Then this is just a table which is on provisions to address lead. So this is so people can see what occurred in the past Congress. So this is like the status quo to understand what the current policy is. And that's sort of pretty much it. Then I thought it'd be good to have an example. So this is, I do not know this person. She is an analyst, which means that she is more at the junior stage than, like, I was a specialist, which meant I was at the senior stage. And you can tell that she has expertise in this area. You'll see here that she has a bachelor's and a master's, no PhD. But the key is that she worked for the state of California on drinking water policy. So this comes back to like real world experience and specialized experience from this UNESCO place. So although like in my division, almost everybody had a PhD, there were people who only had master's degrees, and as long as they had real world experience, they were perfectly fine. Okay, so what I'm going to go over for the report is only the executive summary, which is is limited to 1 page. Like the template will not allow you to exceed 1 page. So that means every single word is a very precious commodity. Having myself tried to get down to that level. So I'm just going to kind of go through each paragraph. So the first paragraph is the status quo. And so it's basically saying, what is the problem? The sort of problem we're addressing here is lead's adverse health effects. Okay, so what causes it? Lead enters drinking water after leaving the treatment plant, where it leaches into water from plumbing material and pipe. So because this is the technical problem, the policy problem, or the policy goal is to control corrosion of plumbing and pipes, and the policy, the overarching policy that's part of this, is the Safe Drinking Water Act, and then it goes through sort of the different ways to do it. So you pretty much get a pretty good feeling just from this first paragraph on the problem that's being addressed, how it's being addressed, and what Congress sort of has done already. Okay, so the second paragraph provides technical background, and you'll see here, like there's different things here that talks about this lead and copper rule, that it does not, it's unlike most regulations because it doesn't have a health-based standard, but rather it has a treatment technique and action level. So those are the policy mechanisms that are being used. And so this kind of just gives a brief, easy to understand technical background about the issue. And then the third part is the program evaluation, which is how well has the program been working so far. So here we learned that lead exposures from drinking water have declined in the United States, but because there has still been lead detected in drinking water, And because technology has advanced, there's interest in enhancing the rule. And so these interim revisions occurred in 2007, and they've worked with all the stakeholders, and now to develop these kind of long-term revisions to the rule. So the fourth is what's happening now. So in this case, we have this effective date, March 16th, of this rule, when the final rule, because in case you don't know, like when there's a rule, a proposed rule, like from a regulatory agency like EPA, you can't just like state the rule. It has to go into the Federal Register for public comment. Then the agency has to look at those comments and then propose a revised rule. So there's draft rules, there's final rules, so forth. That whole nother class that we could do on that one. So, so when they, but then, January 20th, okay, the day he was inaugurated, right? Biden issued a letter directing executive agencies departments to delay it for 60 days so they could take a look at it. After the new administration reviewed it, they extended the effective date from March to December, and they changed the compliance date to 2024. So they're giving people several years to implement it. You know, so they're trying to, you know, they're looking at the reasons for this, looking at the need to modernize, strengthen health protections, and so forth. Okay, and then the fifth paragraph is to say, okay, what happens like if and when this occurs? Now, the reason this is an issue is because it talks about public water systems. So public water systems means that it involves tax dollars. And so this is something where, you know, it's not just like regulating an industry or something like that. It's public money for public health protection. And, you know, it talks about testing for lead in schools, childcare programs, all this other kind of stuff. So this basically says, okay, this is, you know, if this rule goes into effect, this is what's going to happen in your community, right? In the place and for your constituents, which is who you really care about. And then you have here the final conclusion, which is, you know, like these are the challenges, right? So this is like, what does this mean for the public that I represent? It may result in implementation and enforcement challenges for public water systems and states with delegated enforcement authority. You know, public water systems might need additional financial resources to meet the replacement requirements for the infrastructure. And then the alternative compliance options for small water systems could pose challenges to states because states have to help them evaluate, approve, track those implementations for small systems. So, you know, it didn't, so to kind of summarize it, you know, it talked about like what sort of problem we're trying to solve, how the proposal is to solve it, the challenges with using what's proposed to solve, right? So you can get a pretty good feeling for what that might be. You might talk to, like if you're a policymaker, you might go and talk to your state drinking water office or some small things, or talk to people in your constituency. I was actually just talking just before this call, the folks I work with in West Virginia, and it was exactly on kind of small systems issues and small water systems where you only have like less than, you know, you might only have 10 people, like one place has 4 people in town, you know, and it can be a real challenge for these small communities that are in these rural areas. Okay, so the next thing is to go to the shorter version, which is this in focus one, but does anybody have any questions about this before I move on? Okay. Okay, so this is the in focus version. Okay, so the in focus version, I put it on here just so you can see that it's 2 pages. Same author, but it's 2 pages. It's not exactly the same, but it's basically got this sort of the same general theme. So I would not call this a memo. I would call this a policy brief. Okay, because I think I maybe have this on the next page here. Is because memos are directed to specific individuals. So if I was writing this as a memo, it would go to say, let's just say the chair of some subcommittee that does water activities. And I would actually write it differently than I would for this more general audience. So like I said, I would call it, when people talk about one pagers, this is a good example of a one pager. So again, I'm just going to kind of go through this paragraph and just kind of show you how things are kind of neutral. So first, like, why is this issue important? Okay, so you're going to see here, communities may face a range of issues. That's like neutral language. So if you didn't say that, you say, you would say something like, communities have a problem with aging water infrastructure, right? So you're making a statement. You're making a conclusion. But when you say range of issues, you're softening the language. Then you have here, because of lead toxicity, even at low levels, is a public health priority. You can say that because it's been sort of stated by federal agency. But here you also say other sources of lead exposure include lead-based paint and contaminated soil and dust from deteriorated lead-based paint. So they're not blaming all the lead problems that might be in communities on the water, but they're also saying that there's other reasons that people can have lead exposure. And that's important because there's been a lot done over, like, this thing about leaded gasoline. That was like a really big public policy initiative in the 70s, I think. So they're trying to show that people can have health effects from other reasons. Okay, so the second, then we have the sort of the first major section, which is again on what causes a societal problem. And there's, again, this is the background, and it's only 2 paragraphs. This explains, most contaminants when found in public water supplies are detected and treated at a water treatment facility. Lead occurs in tap water once it enters distribution system where water is corrosive and so forth. Okay, so here I note here jargon, right? So you couldn't just use the word corrosion and assume people knew what corrosion officially meant, right? Like, I think most of us would just go ahead and put, oh, yeah, corroded pipes, we all know what that means. But no, they need to define it, what it is, because if you were like writing legislation, you would need to define what corrosion meant. So corrosion is a chemical reaction between the water and the plumbing materials. Factors affecting it are water's acidity, temperature, water use patterns, and the presence of coatings, blah, blah, blah. So they really, she really does a good explanation explaining what corrosion is. This I would often say is one of the hardest things that I would have to write, is trying to explain something like the word corrosion. Because to me, it was like, of course I knew what corrosion was, but trying to simplify it into language everybody can understand, very hard. And then this kind of gives a historical perspective, talking about the 1930s, that lead pipes were used to extend water service and so forth. And this 2016 analysis that talks about all the different aspects of it. Now, you'll notice here, like if you go back to this, you do not see citations, right? This is as opposed to the report, which is like super heavily cited. And that is because this is a summary of an issue. And so if you want all that citations, you're going to have to go back and look at the name. Okay, so here is what most of the space is spent on, which is understanding the policy. So this is the current policy, which is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it talks about these areas. So you see these subheads here to help the reader, just like at a glance, figure it out. So you can look at this and say, okay, well, the two policies that are under Safe Drinking Water are limiting lead and polyamine materials and this lead and copper rule. And that might be all you need to know. If you want to need more, then you read depth. And although you might think a 2-pager is really short, when you're reading stuff all day long and you're rushing around like a crazy person, 2 pages can be really long, particularly when it's something that's hard to understand. The other things that are part of this is that it talks about the technical challenges to the current policy and how well the policy is working. So you might remember that from before in terms of the program evaluation. So right here, you see this last paragraph. This is the current problem we're trying to solve. In 2004, EPA began reviewing this rule after increased lead levels are detected in DC drinking water after water treatment. I actually was in DC at this point, and I remember that. In fact, I think when I even was working for Congress at that point, I can't remember. Anyhow, all the drinking fountains had things in Capitol Hill that said, do not drink the water from the drinking water. So, these requirements are to ensure the state and systems evaluate the potential impact of these corrosion problems that might lead to lead. Okay, then this is basically just talking about the proposed policy. So this summarizes all the different revisions, the replacement requirements, and and then this important area which talks about implementation challenges. So this LSL, the lead replacement, is often identified as a way to permanently remove it. Now note that it doesn't say is the best way or is the way. It uses the words often identified, right? So it doesn't say this is the best way. It says this is a way, and it is the one most commonly recommended. But then it talks about the challenges. It raises a number of implementation challenges, including cost. So that might mean not everything gets replaced and so forth. The costs are going to vary widely, but here's how much it costs. That goes to the sort of economic efficiency sort of side of things, and again talks about the policy and talks about even with full replacement, interior piping or fixtures may remain a source of lead exposure. So this one I've sort of taken excerpts from it, and going back to my 4 E's here, showed like how these are covered. So you have here effectiveness and efficiency, because here it talks about how much it would cost and that it would take decades, right? So it's an assessment of those 2 E's. Then it talks about ease of political acceptability, even though it doesn't do it directly, it does it indirectly by saying that EPA already extended the deadline for 3 years. So as a policymaker, I think, thank goodness, I don't have to really worry about it. I might not even be in office 3 years from now. Then down here, again, we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness, and those things I was talking about before. It's going to cost $1,200 to $12,300 per line. This is equity issues, community water systems and individual owners may face financial challenges to replacing it. And talked about the public water system cannot compel the owner. So if property owners are unable or unwilling to pay for their portion of the replacement, lead may continue to happen. And then over here is something else on effectiveness, which basically talks about even with full replacement, interior plumbing or fixtures and buildings may remain a source of lead exposure. And if systems undertake it, the issues of partial replacement suggest that water systems may need to maintain corrosion control treatment, to prevent lead in tap water. Okay. So you should, after this, have, I would hope, in fact, I will ask this question in chat. Do you think, after going through all this, you have a pretty good sense of the pros and cons? Incorporating these 4 E's of this proposed policy. Just put yes or no in chat. Yeah. So can you see how this is really useful for a policymaker? Because they're going to have a million people coming to them saying, I think you should do this. I think you should do that. And they're going to provide information that is typically will only favor their side of the issue, right? So if you're a policymaker, you just want a neutral source so you can understand the issue enough to have a conversation with these people and not look like an idiot. And then, and keep in mind, this is just one of like 100 issues that you might be working on, right? And, you want to be able to have a conversation. So whomever comes to you from whatever side, you might have, I don't know, some pipe company who's thinking, okay, I'm going to make $1 million by replacing all these lead pipes. And you might have the community system saying, hey, like we can't even get clean drinking water like now from our wastewater treatment plant. How do you expect it, because we can't afford it, how do you expect us to afford to replace all these pipes, right? So they're going to have all these stakeholders coming to them with their perspective on the issue, and wise policymakers try to become well informed on it. And certainly anybody who came to the CRS for something was somebody who wanted to be informed about an issue. So any questions or comments on this? Okay, so I think yes. So we are now basically amazingly on time because this is an 1.5 hour thing. And now what I would like you to do is go into the breakout groups, and with your piece of writing, or like if only one of you has a piece of writing, look at something you've written and just like highlight or circle or whatever makes the most sense if it's digital, to like what kind of words you might need to change if you were writing a CRS document. So you're going to look for words, you're going to look for recommendations, you're going to look for like words like should, all these kinds of things. Does everybody understand that? Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to put everybody into random groups, and we'll give you till 7:20. That's 15 minutes. And feel free to come back to the main room if you just want to ask me questions or whatever. And then we'll have general questions at 20 after. Sound good? Okay. Let me see. Okay. Well, I'm hoping we have some more people who come back. Made it. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so welcome back. So first, before we chat about anything, if you could let me know in chat, was that a useful exercise for you or not? And that way I will know to repeat again. This is the first webinar that I have given on CRS or CRS style writing. So it's good for me to know if this was useful or not useful in general too, by the way. So questions, comments? Okay, Melody. How do CRS reports change depending on the stage at which they're requested? Okay, so preliminary exploration of a topic versus a bill already drafted. So the first thing, and this is something, oh, I'm frozen here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it seems like once the bill has been drafted, neutral options aren't that helpful to the office. Okay, so I guess there's certain, let's just kind of separate things out. If somebody is drafting a bill, then they're probably not going to rely on a general CRS report to draft the bill. Instead, at that stage, a CRS report is primarily meant to determine whether or not they will co-sponsor or vote for the bill. So you might remember sort of like when I was talking about the beginning. So if somebody's drafting a bill, they would generally do it. They would generally request like a confidential memo or consultation or something like that. And like I said, that was about say 70% of what I did, right? Only 30% was on the reports. So they're going to do it more behind the scenes if they're drafting a bill. But you know, like I was, what was I doing? Oh, I was working on industrial energy efficiency. And, you know, there was already like a coalition, bipartisan coalition of several members of the House that were interested in energy efficiency, right? So if one of them like took the initiative to draft a bill, they would want something that they could share with their fellow people who are interested, or say maybe who are members of a caucus, which are again people who are interested in a particular topic, like there's one say on robotics, for example. And then this would help them, you know, the staff make a recommendation to their boss, which probably would be in a memo that would say, yes, we should co-sponsor the bill or we should vote for the bill. It would sort of be at that stage. So if I will say, like I did sometimes when I remember I worked on one report that was on carbon capture. And so it was something at the time that people did not know very much about. Like today, I think it would be probably direct air capture, like carbon dioxide reduction technologies, which is a topic that I have been working on off and on for the past couple of years, right? So it's something emerging. And so the report that it was like I and several of our colleagues wrote was to explain what that technology is. Okay. However, even though it's technical and did all this explanation and so forth, it still always has at the end something that called roughly something like relevant policy relevant policy considerations for Congress. So you would never just prepare something that's totally technical without having that policy context, saying, like things that might be part of the status quo in terms of existing policy. Like, for example, I think we probably would have said something like, the National Energy Technology Lab is currently conducting research on this technology because that's a fossil fuel focused lab. Things like that. And then at the end, we would say, okay, well, here's some things to consider. You'd also put together a list of bills that might already make mention of that technology, which are not always obvious. So hopefully, Melody, that answered your question. Let's see here. Okay. So we have Kavi here. Are these reports ever purely background, or do you always have neutral options? If somebody wanted to request to summarize policy history on a topic, would there be something the CRS would complete? Yes. Okay, so CRS will do whatever the policymaker wants. If they just want, like, what did I do one time? I'm trying to think. I remember I did something for like a member of Congress. I think he was based in Tennessee. He was going to give a speech. And so he wanted to know, all the accomplishments that had been made by this national level, right? Purely factual stuff, right? If that's what the member of Congress wants, that's what you write. So not everything has to be policy analysis. It's just really a matter of degree. So if it's something that could be compiled, that you didn't need somebody like me to do, you didn't need an analyst to do, basically one of these knowledge services group people could do, who are very skilled librarians who know how to put together fact sheets and so forth, then they would do it. But something like this, it would go to somebody like me, because I would have to decide, is this an accomplishment or is this not an accomplishment from my perspective? And so if it required judgment, then it would go to a policy analyst. But if it just required information, then it could go to one of the knowledge service group people. Or it might be a combination effort, like they gathered together the information and then I analyzed it and put together the demo. Like I did, let me see, other things I did was, I think I mentioned before, like questions for congressional hearings. So when people would come up for confirmation, in for Senate confirmation, they might ask me to do like some background research on that individual, come up with a list of questions to ask, that kind of thing. Okay, any other questions? What did you guys learn from the exercise? Any great insights?
It's hard to be neutral.
It's very hard to be neutral. Yes, that is exactly correct, Chanel. It was, like even me, who, like I said, I had been around for 18, 20 years in DC before I got the CRS job. My first paper was covered with red ink, so to speak, because it's really hard to write neutral, and it's only something that you can really learn. And that's why you have so many peer reviewers first, was because, you don't even sometimes realize you have that inherent bias, and you don't even realize that you have it. And that's why often I'll say in classes and so forth, make sure you have somebody else read it, because you just don't recognize it, because it's such a part of your network. But yeah, it's super, super hard. And it takes time to learn it. And, people are hopefully patient with you as you figure it out. Anything else? Okay, so we're roughly on time. I'm going to move to my last thing, which is just an advertisement. So if you guys are interested in science, technology, policy, accounting classes, of which a good portion of you are already taking those, have taken or are taking those classes, please go to my webpage here. I am, NSPN members get 50% off all these classes. You can get professional development funds to help do them. And I have now gotten to the point that you can take them either as part of a cohort or you can take them on demand, because I have recordings of them, and you can watch past Q&A sessions and things like that. So otherwise, that is it for today. So please just put a comment in chat before you go to say, yes, Debbie, this was useful, or no, please don't ever do this again. Just because I know, because it is the first time I've offered this, and our numbers drastically dropped, which I'm hoping is just because people didn't have time, as opposed to, they said, this is a waste of my time. So otherwise, have a good day and stay safe out there. Bye-bye. Hold on a second. I'm ending.